Coming up, an Ojibwe rapper honors Jim Thorpe, and it's a good time to take a look back at the history of the NFL and how Native players helped to shape the game. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those stories next on Indian Country Today.
Arizona PBS is proud to support Indian Country Today. For 6 decades, we've provided television programs and now digital content. But we go beyond that, sending outreach teams across Arizona, offering workshops in language and literacy, family engagement and community outreach, and supporting tribal communities with early learning and school readiness resources. Join us at azpbs.org.
This is Indian Country Today.
Gowatsi Hopa. Thank you for joining us. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. The United States Supreme Court justices are now considering how to rule on a Mississippi abortion case that has the potential to overturn the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade decision. The justices heard the case Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health on Wednesday. The High Court signaled it may allow states to ban abortions at a much earlier time in the pregnancy. After 2 hours of arguments, 6 justices indicated they would likely uphold a Mississippi law that bans abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. This could have major implications for Native women. A report by the Urban Indian Health Institute in 2010 shows that American Indian women suffer from the highest rates of rape and sexual assault, and Indigenous women in the United States are twice as likely than white women to die from conditions caused by pregnancy. An official ruling of the case is not expected until next June, which comes just months before next year's midterm elections. Tomorrow, U.S. Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland and First Lady Jill Biden will travel to Tahlequah, Oklahoma. They will visit the Cherokee Immersion School to learn about the importance of Native language preservation. In 2001, the Cherokee Language Preservation Program was created. At the time, it just had 26 students and 4 staff members. Now there are nearly 100 students in grades K through 6. The idea behind the school is simple: to teach in the Cherokee language and to use the Sequoia syllabary. Michigan's Governor Gretchen Whitmer is abandoning a lawsuit aimed at shutting down an oil pipeline that runs through part of the Great Lakes. Whitmer's legal maneuver follows a federal judge's decision earlier this month. The judge is retaining jurisdiction over a suit brought by Enbridge Energy after the state revoked an easement crossing the Straits of Mackinac. It further complicates a lengthy dispute over the 68-year-old pipeline. Enbridge says Line 5 is a federal matter, raising questions of U.S. law and commerce between the U.S. and Canada. However, Whitmer's administration says the key issue is Michigan's right to protect the Great Lakes. The governor also announced the state will continue to pursue a separate case with the same goal of stopping the pipeline. As the holidays approach, strict COVID protocols are now in place in a Canadian town with a large population of Inuk people. Rankin Inlet is in the province of Nunavut on the Hudson Bay. Anyone who is not fully vaccinated will not be allowed to enter city buildings. The new notice is posted on the city website in both English and in the Inuk language. The notice says proof of vaccination will also be required to attend most public events, such as church services, sporting events, and community gatherings. There are a few exceptions to the new rule. An unvaccinated person may enter a city building to pay a bill or apply for permits or programs. They may also enter if they are there to attend a vaccination clinic. In addition, people who can't get the vaccine due to medical reasons can petition the city. The council passed the ordinance in late October, and it went into effect yesterday. If a person violates this bylaw, they can face a fine of $250 for the first offense and more than $2,000 after the third offense. The new law will remain in place, city officials say, until the government of Nunavut declares the COVID public emergency to be over, or until the council repeals the law. The Miss USA and Miss Teen USA pageant was held on the Muskogee Nation this week. It was held at the River Spirit Casino Resort in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Miss Kentucky Elle Smith was crowned Miss USA. Indigenous contestants took to the stage, including Tanya Crow, who serves as Miss Louisiana. She is from the Choctaw and Chapapili Nations. Crow placed at the top 16 at the Miss USA pageant. And those are the headlines for Indian Country today. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Coming up, an Ojibwe rapper is inspired by the legacy of Jim Thorpe. And later, we'll take a look at the history of the NFL. Jim Thorpe has inspired generations of athletes, and his reach continues to expand. Ojibwe and Oneida hip-hop artist Tall Paul is now honoring Thorpe through music. His new album is believed to be the first musical collection paying tribute to Jim Thorpe's legacy. Tall Paul joins us now to tell us about his efforts to honor Jim Thorpe. Welcome, Tall Paul.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So tell us about this video project that you've been working on.
Yeah, so this film project is a promotional video for my album, but also just to help further extend the legacy of Jim Thorpe because of his representation of Native people. So when I was young, I was looking into Native athletes and superstars because there weren't many on the TV screen or radios or anything like that when I was a kid. There was nobody I could really relate to on that level. And then I found out about Jim Thorpe, 1912 gold Olympic medalist, NFL Hall of Famer, Major League Baseball player, ballroom dance champion, just real random. He was just basically a very athletically gifted Indigenous man, and that inspired me as a young Native athlete. So now today, as I'm in my adulthood, I thought it would be awesome to make an album about him to, further extend his legacy and also to do this project, this film project.
Sure. Well, let's take a look at this short film.
Growing up, I didn't have any positive role models who were pushing me to do excellent things with my life. My dad wasn't around. He had been in prison. My mom had her own struggles, abusive relationships and things like that. The history books, the movies, they all reinforce this stereotype that we're alcoholics or somehow less competent. And as a kid, I subconsciously believed that or wondered, But all that changed when I discovered who Jim Thorpe was. He broke those falsehoods.
Something that we saw in the film, of course, was this idea of Indigenous excellence, and Jim Thorpe being an example of that. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. So again, just reverting back to my childhood, something that kind of subconsciously seeped into my mind because I wasn't seeing Indigenous superstars in basketball or football. It made me subconsciously think as a young kid, I'm 10, 11 years old at the time, like, oh, maybe we as Indigenous people aren't as capable or something. Maybe that's why we're not on the TV. It wasn't anybody clearly telling me that, but that's what the message was that I was receiving. So as I got older, I realized the importance of positive, strong, excellent Indigenous representation. And I was like, more people need to know about Jim Thorpe because not a lot of people talk about him. When like the greatest athlete of all time discussions come up, there are very few people who mention him. So I'm like, well, if I combine his legacy with hip hop, which is something that is universally trending around the world, maybe I can do something to help get his legacy out there more, get his name out there more, to help other kids realize that we are capable, not just through him, but you also see more and more Native stars coming out more recently in the media. So it's all about representation and showing Native youth and communities that we are capable of doing all of these same things that we see others doing on the big screen and so on.
And on that notion of representation, I think, as you just mentioned, anecdotally, as young kids, if we don't see Native people who look like us when we're growing up, it really limits the way that we see ourselves when we grow up. And now researchers and professors are now finding that that is in fact supported by data. So I just think that that's really interesting, that a lot of our lived experiences is now being validated by actual data showing us that that's the case.
Oh yeah, that's amazing. I'm glad that they're bringing some, science into it and really proving it in their way, because these are things that we always knew as Indigenous people through our own experiences. But yeah, I'm glad to hear that they're doing some data around that.
And I want to talk about sort of the artistic nature of this film, and more specifically about your music. Tell us, how did that process play out for you when you were writing these songs and producing them?
Yeah, so a lot of people ask me, like, how long has it been that you've been working on this album, things like that, because it's not released yet. It's forthcoming, but it's been a few years, and it's a lot of it has been research. So it's been pretty much an academic kind of situation where it's more than just writing an album or creating music. It's been researching his life, researching people who know him and what they've had to say about him, and then making sure that I accurately portray all of that in my lyrics within the songs. So that's how it came about. It started by watching a documentary on him, and then watching some different interviews with his sons and so on, and historians who have I guess, become experts on his legacy. I've been following all these different content providers on his life and just doing my research on his life and making sure to accurately portray his story as well as those around him when he was growing up. I talk a little bit about his father and his mother and some of his friends and things like that in the lyrics as well. His experience in the boarding schools, his experience in the NFL, and so on. So that's what the process has been. It's been very academic. It's definitely not my typical situation when it comes to writing music.
And that's exactly what I was going to ask you, is typically, do you do that kind of background research on projects?
Yeah, it's definitely not typical. I have done some of it somewhat, but it's definitely not the norm at all.
Sure, and I'm sure that that'll inform the writing, as you said, and how these songs are conveyed. Can you tell us more about when you expect this album to be released, and maybe how many songs will be on it?
So I'm aiming for spring, so roughly like April 2022 is what I'm aiming for, and then there will be roughly 10 songs on it. Yep.
That's really good to hear. So I want to hear more about, sort of what it was like for you to explore this identity of Jim Thorpe, given that, of course, he is now an ancestor. He's no longer here anymore. But what did it feel like to research so much about a person that you've never actually met yourself, and trying, I guess, to put the bits and pieces together of who this individual was?
Yeah, it was a very... It was a cool situation because I felt like I was getting to know somebody who you said, you mentioned he's an ancestor now. He's not with us, but he was probably one of my biggest role models, honestly, as a young kid, and one of my biggest inspirations. And, by that time, he had already been gone for half a century. So that was a cool process, just learning more about him, some of his personal struggles, some of his accomplishments, me being a young Native athlete, who has been around addiction and things like that. I heard that he struggled with some of that kind of stuff. So it was completely relatable. I felt like I was getting to know who he was as a person and not just as an athlete or superstar of his day. But yeah, that was what it was like for me. It was just very revealing. It made me connect more to him and who he was.
As someone who grew up in the city and as an urban Indian, how do you think that urban Indian people stay connected to culture and to language?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I know in my experience, it wasn't around a whole lot as a young kid. But what I've found is that, when we go into like language camps or classes where they teach us the language, that is how we stay connected. You know, myself, I got really connected actually in college. I was going to the University of Minnesota, and I had a 2-year language requirement. But it was much more than a language class. My instructor would invite us over to his house and learn Sweat Lodge prayer songs. We'd have feasts, and he would teach us a lot about the culture through the language. We'd even be able to join him at Sweat Lodge ceremony and things like that. So I feel like it's tapping into those resources that our elders and our community leaders provide us when we're in the city, because there are still, you know, sweat lodges and other things that we can do here in the city.
And I think what's really interesting, as you said, it wasn't until college that you started really honing in on this type of learning and furthering yourself. And I think it's an example of it's never too late to start.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. It's never too late. And I get people who ask me those questions all the time. You know, how can I tap into my culture? How can I learn more about who I am as a Native or Indigenous person? And I just kind of tell them my experience. You know, you got to seek out those tribal elders and community leaders who provide these kind of experiences and resources, who are practicing our culture, and just, you know, ask them like, hey, I'm looking to learn more about my culture. Could you help me or help point me in the right direction? And that's what my experience was.
Sure. Since this short film has been released, what has been the reaction to it?
So it's been generally positive. I mean, it's been 100% positive. I actually seen one of the youth actors in it post part of it on Facebook, and he was really pumped up. He was like, "Oh yeah, I'm playing this younger version of Tall Paul," and he doesn't understand it's a documentary. He called it a music video. It's not a music video, but there's music playing in the background, so that's probably why he thought that. But you know, he was really pumped up and excited, and his parents and community members started commenting on it and tagging me in the comments like, hey, thank you for doing this. So yeah, it's been a positive reaction.
Great. Well, as I said in the intro, all these years later and Jim Thorpe's legacy continues on.
Yes, for sure it does.
Well, Tall Paul, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Wish.
When we come back, more on Jim Thorpe and the impact he's made on the NFL. We're in the thick of football season, and as Tall Paul just told us, his new film honors the legacy of Jim Thorpe. This is the 101st year of the National Football League, and many people might not know the mark that Jim Thorpe made on this all-American sport. The league started in 1920 in Canton, Ohio, as the American Professional Football Association. The president of that organization was Jim Thorpe. He is a citizen of the Sac and Fox Nation, and actually, his football career went back to the days when he attended the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. His coach there was Pop Warner. Caitlin Onawa Boycell has more on the impact Indigenous people have made on this highly popular sport of professional football.
At the turn of the 20th century, the leading football team came from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was the first boarding school run by the U.S. government. Assimilating into a white Christian culture was the goal, and young Native children were forced to leave their families to attend this boarding school. They were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their religions.
When they arrived at Carlisle, their heads were shaved, their clothes were burned in front of them, and they were put in front of a blackboard with names written in chalk on the blackboards. And they couldn't read the names, but they were instructed to point to a name, and then that was their name.
The conditions were crude. They were fed a poor diet, and the dorms were overcrowded, making it easy for disease to spread quickly, killing young children. Thorpe came to Carlisle when he was 16 years old. Still, it was at this school and under these horrific conditions that a powerhouse football team was born. And by 1907, they were considered one of the most dynamic football teams. The players came from several different tribes. Frank Mount Pleasant is recognized with inventing the spiral pass. He was from the Tuscarora Nation. The team also pioneered the overhand spiral and other trick plays that frustrated their opponents, as documented by the school and in media reports. Elmer Bush was from the Pomo tribe, and he was inducted into the American Indian Hall of Fame in 1973. They both played with Thorpe at Carlisle. Jim Thorpe is considered one of the greatest athletes of all time. He inspired future Indigenous football players like my grandfather, Glenn Condren.
Jim Thorpe was a Native American, was a superhero. I mean, and he was a super athlete. And he played, I guess, every sport there was, and he did well at every one of them. So
Thorpe was an outstanding runner. He earned a spot on the U.S. track team and went to the 1912 Olympics. There he easily won both the pentathlon and decathlon. Later, he was accused of playing for money because he joined the New York Giants baseball club. His gold medals were taken away by the Olympic Committee and later returned. Today, he is listed as a co-champion. But some say that isn't enough.
It means so much to Indian country to restore these honors. So the letter was sent to the president of the IOC saying, we'd like to work this out, work with you. We've started the petition. You know, we are very interested in getting this done. And we actually never heard back from him. He had one of his librarians send us a letter, and which had some actual factual information that was incorrect. So
still, to this day, his family fights for his recognition in the Olympics. After high school, Thorpe joined the first Indigenous national football team called the Oorang Indians. The team was based in LaRue, Ohio. Walter Lingo started the team in 1922, and at that time, the NFL franchise fee was just $100 a year. The team wasn't the best. They only won 3 games in 2 years of playing. Lingo focused a lot of his team's efforts on halftime shows to entertain the crowd and advertise for his business. He owned a dog kennel and trained the dogs to perform tricks with the players. Still, Thorpe was a part of many firsts in football, including becoming the first president of the American Professional Football Association, known today as the NFL. None of this history is taught in America's public schools, not the history of government running boarding schools, and not the history of how the football players influenced the game.
And you kind of see the erasure of American history in Native Americans, not just in football. You can't say we should try to see it in all of American history. So I'm glad, we're kind of retelling this.
Because of his influence on the game, Thorpe was inducted into the Professional Football Hall of Fame, inspiring other NFL players like Jim Warren. Warren had an outstanding college career at Arizona State University. In 1987, he was on the team that won the Rose Bowl. He went on to play for the Cincinnati Bengals and the Detroit Lions and Tampa Bay, inspired by the legacy of Jim Thorpe.
It was still influential to me to see a Native person as the greatest athlete in the world.
After Warren retired from the NFL, he went into the film industry and used his voice to raise the issue of misrepresentation of natives in football. A film he produced about the use of native mascots premiered on the Fox network on Thanksgiving in 2020.
I never did play for a team with a Native mascot, but I played against teams with Native mascots. So obviously I was a target of people that wanted to say things like scalp the Indian or cut your hair.
And then, of course, when George Preston Marshall took over the football team in Washington, dropping the name on there that became so offensive that we recently saw changed because of economic pressure, not so much because of a battle of conscience. It's really opened up some eyes to help people try to rediscover the Native American impact on football, on this country.
Other notable players include Sam Bradford, who is from the Cherokee Nation and a Heisman Trophy winner. Also wide receiver that plays for the LA Chargers, Keenan Allen, who is Lumbee. And starting quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys, Dak Prescott, who is Choctaw and Apache. And more than 60 Pacific Islanders have been a part of the NFL, according to the Pacific Islanders Football Hall of Fame. And they all have this one thing in common.
You're only as good as your last play. I mean, and you never know when your last play is either.
Behind the scenes, there's one man who's looking to groom the next generation of Indigenous professional players. For 13 years, Robert Judkins has led the live production of NFL games. His job is to make sure viewers can watch their favorite team with no interruptions. He saw a need for training and held his first football camp in Southern California on the land of the Soboba Band of Luiseño Indians. 100 kids turned out, as well as some professional football players.
There are a lot of Native kids, especially in the high school ranks, that don't get exposure. Some great talent that's out there. I mean, definitely D1 prospects that are out there. And so I think there's a need for exposure and to get kids at a younger age exposed to the game of football and just exposed to sports in general.
From future D1 prospects to being considered one of the greatest athletes of all time, Indigenous people have led the effort in football. But will there ever be another Jim Thorpe?
I'm trying to think of athletes who try to do more than one sport, and I just don't think our society is structured in that capacity. I think if someone shows a great deal of skill, it's not to say it can't happen, but I think it's very unlikely.
It's been more than 109 years since Jim Thorpe and his teammates came up with trick plays that you still see today. So the next time you watch football, think about the Carlisle Indians and Jim Thorpe and how they shaped the game. Kaylin Anawa-Boycel, Indian Country Today.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news and updates, visit us anytime at IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing rock. This is Indian Country Today.